morning, if you would. Loving God, as we continue the series on the parables, please open our hearts and minds to hear what you are saying to us. And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. You are our rock and you are our Redeemer. On Friday afternoon, the preaching world and our denomination, the Christian church, lost a giant in the field of preaching with the death of Dr. Fred Craddock. He passed away at his home in Blue Ridge, Georgia. Dr. Craddock was born and raised in a poor family in Humboldt, Tennessee. He went to Johnson Bible College, then on to Phillips Seminary in Enid, Oklahoma. And then he came here to Nashville and did a PhD in New Testament and had a long career as a homiletics professor, a preaching professor at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University. You may remember that Dr. Craddock last preached here at Woodmont in July of 2011 during the General Assembly, a sermon called Jesus Saves, and we're going to try to get that on our website this week. But he has inspired thousands of preachers and lay leaders. He can be considered a preaching genius. There's an article written by one of my advisors from Sewanee and Christian Century on him that came out at the end of February. The timing is very ironic, and I'd encourage you to go and read that. But my dad and I are going to head down to Blue Ridge, Georgia tomorrow and be there for the service tomorrow afternoon. But he leaves us with so many quotes and stories. Two quotes that I love. One, Dr. Craddock said, "Preach as if you know they almost didn't come." He also said, "I'm thankful for work that is far greater than how I might feel on any given day." And then one of the stories that he tells that I love is about a conversation he had with a greyhound dog when he went to visit his niece, and he struck up a conversation, and he said, "So are you still racing?" This dog used to race. The dog said, "No, I don't race anymore." And he said, "Well, what's the matter? Did you get sick?" He said, "No, I didn't get sick." He said, "Are you crippled?" He said, "No." He said, "What's wrong? You couldn't win any races, couldn't win any money?" The dog said, "No, I won $1 million from my owner." He said, well, what's wrong? Why aren't you racing anymore?" And the dog said, "I quit." He said, "You quit?" He said, "Yeah, I quit." He said, "All those years of running and running and running around the track, and I finally figured out that thing that we were chasing wasn't even a real rabbit." And it makes me think about how many of us in life are chasing things that aren't real, fake rabbits of different sorts. We're going to miss Dr. Craddock, and I ask you to keep his wife Nettie and their family in your prayers. Last night I was getting my 3-year-old out of the bathtub and getting him ready for bed. And he said, "Daddy, what are we going to study in Sunday school tomorrow?" And I said, "Is it Abraham?" He said, "No, we're not going to study Abraham." I said, "Is it Zacchaeus?" He said, "No, we're not going to study Zacchaeus." I said, "Well, is it Jesus?" And he said, "No, Daddy, we already studied Jesus." And the truth is, we never get tired of studying Jesus. And that's what we're doing with these parables, is we're studying Jesus and we're trying to learn more about what he calls us to be and do in our own lives. Summer of 1998, I had just graduated from high school, and I was eagerly waiting to go off to college at TCU. It was July, and I got a phone call from a neighbor of ours who had asked if I would come and house sit for them while they went out of town. And I thought, well, of course I'll house sit for you. I'm a responsible adult about to go off to college. And so I did that. Well, it was a Friday afternoon, and I decided that I wanted to have a little get-together at the house where I was house-sitting. And so I made a few phone calls to people and told them to come over. We were going to have a pool party. The house had a pool, by the way. And the problem was the people that I called also called people, and they also called people. Well, about an hour after I decided to have this get-together, my mother called me and asked me if I would watch my youngest brother, who was 7 at the time, while they went out for their anniversary dinner. Well, what was I going to say? "No, Mom, I've got a party going down here." I said, "No, of course I'll watch Jordan." So Jordan came over, and people started showing up, and I had Jordan in the back bedroom with his video games, and I told him, I said, if you need anything, you come get me. And when you want to go to bed, you come and get me. And Jordan walked out during the party at one point, and he said, I'm ready to go to bed. And I said, okay. And I came back and I tucked him in the bed, but I could tell he wondered where all of these people were coming from. This wasn't just a get-together. This was one of those parties that 18-year-olds dream of. It had just kind of gotten out of control. Well, about this time, my parents came home from their anniversary dinner, and the house was down the street from our house. It was in a cove, and they saw nothing but cars in the cove and familiar 18-year-olds walking up and down the street. And so my parents decided that they needed to come pay a visit to the party. And so they did. And they showed up in the kitchen, and they came to get Jordan, and they were not happy with their oldest son at that point. So at that point, there were only two things left to do. Start telling everybody that the police were there, which clears out any 18-year-old party in a heartbeat. And then I had to go and earnestly beg for forgiveness. Forgiveness. It's a word that Christians are really good at throwing around, but we're not quite as good at actually putting it into practice. When Peter comes up to Jesus and says, Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? 7 times? And what does Jesus say? No, not 7 times, but 77 times, or in some translations, 70 times 7. I remember that verse, and I told my parents about that verse the summer of 1998. Now, in this passage, Jesus is specifically talking about another member of the church, because Jesus knew that it is impossible to sustain a faith community without forgiveness. But forgiveness should not prevent us from learning lessons, and forgiveness should not prevent us from holding each other accountable. Why do so many of us struggle with it? Is it our ego? Is it our pride? Is it our refusal to let go of the past? Is it our determination to maintain the upper hand over somebody who has done us wrong so that we can play that card whenever we feel like it? Why is it so difficult to forgive? Jesus tells us to do it. It's part of the Christian life. Mahatma Gandhi once said that the weak can never forgive. It's only an attribute of the strong. Martin Luther King said that he who is devoid of the power to forgive is devoid of the power to love. Bishop Tutu, without forgiveness there is no future. And Reinhold Niebuhr said that forgiveness is the final form of love. Forgiveness is crucial to living the Christian life. Jesus gives us another parable in Matthew's gospel. It's the parable of the unforgiving servant or a slave. The story of this man who owed 10,000 talents to the king, and the king called him in to demand his payment, and he could not pay it. And so he begged and pleaded with the king, have mercy on me. And the king said, okay, I will. And then what does the guy do? He goes out, and the first person that he runs into that owes him 100 denarii, which is a small amount of money, he tells him to pay him what he owed. And the guy said, have mercy upon me, have mercy upon me, kind of like the other slave had said to the king. But he didn't do it. And when the king hears about this, he is irate, because the slave to whom he showed forgiveness could not show that same forgiveness to somebody else. What can we learn from this parable? What are the lessons that we can infer on the subject of forgiveness? There are many. There's the obvious one that we cannot expect to be forgiven in life unless we are willing to go and forgive other people. It's the golden rule in action. There are lots of people in this world who treat other people one way, and then they expect to be treated differently themselves. The people in this world who have been forgiven of some terrible wrongdoings, but who still refuse to show grace and mercy to other people. And I've never really understood this, because I do believe that what goes around comes around in life. It's not that life is fair. We all know that life isn't fair. But if you love other people and if you show mercy and compassion to other people, then typically that's going to come back to you. And if you don't love other people and you don't show mercy and compassion and forgiveness, then that's probably going to come back to you as well. Secondly, we should forgive as many times as is necessary. Jesus tells Peter, not 7 times, but 77 times, or 70 times 7. But I would say that forgiving does not necessarily mean forgetting. Thomas Zaz, an Austrian psychiatrist, once said this: the stupid neither forgive nor forget. The naive forgive and then forget. But the wise forgive, but do not forget. It's that old question in life: do you have to forget to forgive? And I think the answer is no. I mean, you don't want to keep bringing it up, but we do have memories. Is it possible to totally forget when somebody does us wrong? Just because we have forgiven somebody doesn't mean that we have to put ourselves in the place to be hurt again. You know, you've heard that saying, hurt me once, shame on you. Hurt me twice, shame on me. Now, where this gets tricky is when it comes to marriage and family and those that we love the most. I mean, it's one thing in business if somebody does you wrong and messes you over to make a decision to not do business with that person again. But what about in your marriage? What about with your children? What about with your closest friends? I don't think that it's possible to continue those relationships and to not leave yourself vulnerable again. The people that you love the most can hurt you the deepest. It's always been true. Human beings are really, really good coming up with all the reasons in the world why we shouldn't forgive. But Christ calls us to forgive, which is my third point. We're called to forgive because God has forgiven us and calls us to do the same. We really don't have a choice in the matter if we believe what we pray in the Lord's Prayer every week. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. We have to take Jesus at his word. Now, forgiveness doesn't have to be quick. It doesn't have to happen overnight. But ultimately, we're called to forgive. I think about this, when I'll counsel different couples that have had to deal with infidelity, and what's the difference between the couple that is able to forgive each other and move on in their marriage and the couple that just simply can't do it? What's the difference? Forgiveness is also difficult because sometimes it's not necessarily what you do that you need forgiveness for. It can also be what you don't do. I found this in the ministry to be true. It's when you weren't there for somebody, when you didn't check on them when they needed you, when they expected you to call or to show up and you were out of town or you were busy. We can hurt people without even trying, which is all the more reason why we need forgiveness. And the more that we learn to forgive, the more often we do it, the better we get at doing it, and the more natural it becomes. Which leads me to my final point, but really the message I want you to hear this morning. Forgiveness is liberating. When we learn to forgive others in life, not only is that a gift to them, but it's also a gift to ourselves. You see, some people go through life never forgiving others because they just can't, and so they carry more weight and stress and emotional baggage with them than they have to. But guess what? You can make the choice to forgive, and you can shed some of that weight. But first, you have to decide to do it. Everybody here has things in their past that they would just assume leave in the past, things for which we all need forgiveness, things that we don't want to be brought up over and over again. But you have to make a decision to forgive and to ask for forgiveness. It's choice. And we'll never find the peace in life that we're all searching for until we make that choice to say, please forgive me, or to say, I forgive you. Now some will ask, does the person have to want forgiveness for you to forgive them? And the answer is no. Of course, it's nice if they ask for forgiveness. But if they don't ask for forgiveness, then you're left carrying the burden. One of the biggest challenges in life I've found for all of us is to forgive ourselves. Because until we learn to forgive ourselves and until we learn to accept God's forgiveness and God's grace, then it's going to be really hard for us to go and extend that grace and that forgiveness to other people. Forgiveness has liberating power. Liberating power in your marriage. Liberating power in your friendships, liberating power in your family, liberating power in your work life. You can wipe the slate clean and begin anew. And the truth is, we all need it. Therefore, we should all show it. Somebody once said that failing to forgive and holding on to anger is like drinking a poison and waiting for somebody else to die. I was far too young to remember this, but some of you remember Monday, March the 30th, 1981. He'd only been in office 69 days, but President Ronald Reagan was leaving the Hilton Hotel in Washington after a speaking engagement when all of a sudden shots rang out and bullets ricocheted off of a limousine, and one of them lodged in Reagan's lung just a couple of inches from his heart. And it was John Hinckley, Jr., who was the culprit. They rushed Reagan to the hospital, and they put him on the operating table. And you remember that famous line when he looked up and he looked at all the doctors and he said, I hope you're all Republicans. Well, years later, his daughter, Patty Davis, wrote a book called Angels Don't Die, My Father's Gift of Faith. And she talked about this terrible day in her family's life, this day that her father was shot. He was the only living president to be shot and to survive. But this is what she said in that book, and I want to leave you with her words this morning. She said, my father knew that his physical healing was directly dependent upon his ability to forgive John Hinckley. Forgiveness is hard work, but my father made it sound effortless. He would always say that we are all God's children. Maybe at one time I chalked it up to the language of a church-going man, but when he referred to John Hinckley as misguided, I felt the weight of that word and what it said about my father. He never expressed hatred for the man who had shot him. He expressed pity. He knew in his world that even Hinckley belonged to God. That's the kind of knowledge that leads to forgiveness. It transforms.